war machine was driving toward the Caucasus on the west, while Rommel's Afrika Korps neared El Alamein. And the fear was a Nazi link-up between those two. There continued ominous intelligence reports of German heavy water production in Norway. The Allies were in the shadow of what General Marshall called a very black hour. In Washington, the Assistant Chief of Staff in charge of war plans, Major General Dwight Eisenhower, drafted a plan to strike a major blow against the Germans in Europe. It called for a cross-channel invasion of France on the Normandy beaches. It was the beginning of what was to be the biggest military operation in history. It would take 2 years of planning, building, and preparation. And D-Day would mark the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany.
He had to decide on whether to go with the weather the way it was or to postpone it 2 weeks.
General of the Army Omar Bradley recalls the agony of decision on those fateful days in June of 1944 as the Supreme Allied Commander weighed invasion against delay.
You could only get a suitable tide and daylight together once every 2 weeks. And if we didn't go on the June the 5th, 6th, or 7th, we couldn't go until 2 weeks later.
I possibly sat silently just reviewing these things, maybe, I'd say 35 or 45 seconds. I just got up and said, okay, we'll go, and this room was emptied in 2 seconds.
The Eisenhower Years, a chronicle in sound of the life of Dwight Eisenhower, produced by Extension Radio Television at Kansas State University.
The superlatives regarding D-Day and its planning are myriad. The mightiest armada ever, the biggest military operation in history, the beginning of the end for Hitler. D-Day was all of those. It involved staggering amounts of money, energy, and endurance. Actually, the concept of an Allied return to the continent was born in the minds of the British at Dunkirk. Churchill assigned a small group of planners the task of devising such a plan in 1940. But the specific cross-channel plan came from Eisenhower in 1942. It was that year that then Brigadier General Eisenhower was named Assistant Chief of Staff in charge of war plans in Washington. In a memo to his boss, General George Marshall, Eisenhower outlined his views of global strategy, and a key point was the retention of Russia in the war. He called for materiel aid to Russia and also an Allied thrust to Europe big enough to draw off a sizable portion of the German army on the Russian front. His plan was for a cross-channel invasion. Roosevelt and the U.S. Chiefs of Staff agreed to it for the spring of 1943. Churchill asked for and got an invasion of North Africa first, and the cross-channel invasion was put off until 1944. Full-scale planning of the invasion was started in 43, commanded by a British Lieutenant General, Frederick Morgan. Joining the staff that year was U.S. General Omar Bradley.
The British staff had been working on the landing for several months when I went to England in October, the 1st of October of 43. And we didn't get out to detailed planning until I came up in January. He came up from North Africa, having been designated to take Supreme Command, and made several basic decisions. And then from then on, from January on till June, we were doing planning, detailed planning.
In the last 2 months of 1943, the time came for President Roosevelt to name a Supreme Allied Commander. The choice in everyone's mind was between Generals Marshall and Eisenhower. It was Roosevelt's decision. Author, biographer Ken Davis says Roosevelt originally opted for Marshall.
I think Marshall himself made the decision in a sort of funny way. Marshall wanted it. Oh God, how he wanted to be Supreme Commander. He wanted it so bad, but he also realized that he had been tangling with the British all these years. They tangled at the Arcadia Conference. They tangled over and over again. They tangled about torch. He was opposed to torch. he and the British had been fighting, as he had to do. I mean, he was the American, and so that he could not have done as well as Ike did, because he was already tagged with certain points of view, whereas Ike had none that he was tagged with. So that if Marshall had said he wanted it, he would have had it. Roosevelt would have appointed him, and certainly Churchill would have gone along. And a lot of other people thought that they couldn't live without Marshall in Washington. Roosevelt himself said, to Marshall, he said, I don't think I could sleep well at nights with you out of the country. So I really think it was Marshall who decided that he should not be and that Ike should be. Ultimately, it was him.
The announcement of General Eisenhower's appointment as Supreme Allied Commander came on Christmas Eve, 1943. Ike arrived in London the next month, and the man who became his public relations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Thor Smith, remembers that day.
He arrived in the middle of one of the very worst historical pea soup fogs that London has ever had. And of course, we were in a frenzy to get the releases out and all that sort of thing, and we actually had to walk from one place to another in front of a Jeep with a flashlight. It was as bad as all that. One of the first things we had to do was get a picture of the high command, General Ike and Tedder and all the rest of the big brass. The famous war room picture that you've seen around was trying to get all of that brass together in one room, and with all the cameramen that wanted to get a picture of it. It was really quite a first assignment for me with General Ike.
Many people feel that Eisenhower's greatest accomplishment was the forging of Schaeff, his ability to weld and then wield an Allied sword. Biographer Kenneth Davis.
He knew what Schaeff ought to be. He insisted that there be an actual fusion and no nationalism whatever in the headquarters. And he insisted on optimism and courage, and he did a beautiful job there. It was Ike who made Schaeff.
But Ike had his problems in managing the British and American brass. And one of his biggest problems was Field Marshal Montgomery. They frequently clashed on tactical decisions, and Ike often found Montgomery hard to handle. General Omar Bradley.
He was hard to handle, yes. And he always was very egotistical. And he thought he should have been made the Supreme Ground Commander. And Ike insisted that he was acting as such. He was a little bit hard to handle sometimes by Ike. But after all, Ike got us to work together. And we won. Always a big thing. He won.
Thor Smith, who now had become Ike's public relations officer, recalls the problems with General Montgomery and says they were heightened by the British press.
In a way, some of the British press had a sort of a chip on the shoulder, General Ike's main concern all through this was not to disturb the Allied unity. But the press, admittedly, they were constantly speculating about is Marty number 2 in command, or when's General Bradley going to take charge of American troops in the field, and any shift at all was considered a slight on the other, and it ended up being this is one of the stickiest problems that General Eisenhower had to cope with, and of course the press didn't help any, and in this respect, why he was a little bit sensitive toward any think pieces about the command structure.
About the first thing Eisenhower did after assuming command was to enlarge the D-Day plan. Both he and Montgomery felt that it was not broad enough. The Cossack plan called for a 3-division amphibious assault on the Normandy coast, with the assumption that there would also be simultaneous landings on the south of France with 2 divisions. But all the key leaders, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Marshall, and Churchill, agreed the 3-division landing at Normandy was too small. It was expanded to include all 5 divisions, and the south of France operation was delayed. Now the planning, detailed planning, became intense. General Bradley.
You were working 18 or 20 hours a day, and you had to have certain basic decisions on which to break it down. And the planning of an invasion, amphibious operation, is a very detailed job. You have to plan the load of every little boat that goes in, every landing craft. And I remember one figure which is rather impressive to me, and that is that during the first, I think it's 4 hours, we landed some 7,000 different items on the beach, and they had to be in the right proportion. That includes different surgical instruments and weapons and ammunition and everything else. 7,000 different items that had to be planned to go in the right landing craft. Takes a lot of detail.
We had to have a particular combination of tides, light, and moon. And this was showed that you had about a few days in June where you could have the perfect conditions, or nearly perfect conditions, and a few days in May. We'd like to have gone on the 5th of May. But to get the breadth of attack we thought necessary, we had to wait until June. Now, the ideal days were from June 4th. 5th was the ideal day, but 4th was satisfactory, 5th, 6th, and 7th, and even possibly 8th. But that would have been stretching a little bit. Now, I picked June 5th as the best. And we came down here hoping and praying that the weather would be sufficiently good we could go on the June 5th.
Had to approve the beaches on which we landed, which was quite a decision. Where do we go, Pas-de-Calais or Normandy, or go farther south? Where do you go? You had to approve that. You had to decide on the troops that would land on each of the 5 beaches and what support they could get. And he had a lot of decisions to be made in connection with D-Day. And it turned out they were all good.
By now, the British Isles were jammed with men and equipment. So much that a common joke was the only thing keeping her afloat were the barrage balloons. Logistics became the key element of the war against Hitler, and the massive plan took final shape. It was massive in more ways than one. For instance, a complete set of Navy orders, including maps, weighed 300 pounds. And while this went on, so did a concerted intelligence effort to fool the Germans across the Channel. General Bradley.
The German agents in England, and the British knew them pretty well, they were tipped off that we were going to invade in Pas-de-Calais, and we built up a paper army in East England. We even took the radio operators from Africa, and with certain divisions, and because they get to know the radio operator's touch, the way you know somebody's voice. So we actually sent these operators up, and they sent messages back and forth. The Germans, of course, picked them up, and they believed we were going to invade at Pas-de-Calais. We even went to the trouble of building platforms that looked like boats. For example, just take boards and lay them on the water in the shape of a hull of a ship. From there, it looks like a ship. And we even went to the trouble of laying those boards up there to make them look like ships in those harbors and so forth. And they left that 15th Army up around Pas-de-Calais even after we landed in Normandy, because they were sure that was just a feint and we were going to make the main landing at Pas-de-Calais. That was Hitler's idea mostly. I think the German general saw through it, but Hitler wouldn't give in. He said those divisions had to remain up there for the main invasion. And they didn't pull them out until we broke out of the beachhead, 25th of July.
Thor Smith.
It was one of the best cover and deception plans, I'm told, has ever been handled in the history of warfare. I saw a list one time of all the different elements of the cover and deception plan that went on, and it was about 25 different things, all knitted together like this. By that I mean, fake divisions here and a fake story in a newspaper there, and the thing was all buttoned up.
An invasion of Europe involving men by the millions, more than 10,000 planes, in excess of 1,000 ships. And yet it had to remain secret. There were hair-raising slip-ups, but the Germans never really found out. General Bradley.
I still don't understand, because too many people knew about it. We went on the basis that only those who needed to know were told about it. But I know a lot of people that didn't need to know were told about it. And it's just still a miracle to me why the Germans didn't pick it up.
Eisenhower's personal aide, Harry Butcher.
There were numerous incidents that were very worrisome. Officer or two talking at a cocktail party, giving the date of D-Day. It really hadn't been settled, but first week of June was close enough, you know. There was a case of turning up in Chicago, all of the plans at the home of a German-named family, a family of German descent with a German name, in a great batch of mimeographs, the plans for D-Day. And this caused a lot of consternation. It was discovered by some counterintelligence officers or listed men in Chicago. And, of course, the word came back to our headquarters, and it was looked into immediately. And what had happened was that a GI in the mailroom, taken about his family, inadvertently addresses this package to his family. It's supposed to go to the War Department by courier, but in some way it gets in the mail addressed to his family. So it was a scare for a while. But then on the night of D-Day, the day before D-Day, one of the American Press Associations in its London office inadvertently put on a D-Day announcement in practice. But fortunately, it was caught before it ever got printed.
As the time for the invasion drew nearer, the planning phase was completed. Then it became a question of time as the buildup of men and machines continued. It was also a question of what to do with General Ike for his aide, Harry Butcher.
From where I sat in this tent camp, it was a problem of trying to keep some diversion for General Ike. Maybe you'd play some bridge, and maybe you'd dream up a trip to see the paratroopers the night of D-Day. Maybe you'd go down to what they call the hards, the places where the landing craft loaded with troops and the like, go and keep busy, keep something going on.
Thor Smith.
A long time before the advanced command post was set up, why, he started in going out visiting the troops all over England. He would take Churchill along one time and Montgomery along another time, and frequently go on his own. And so we were really traveling tourists there for several months before D-Day. He felt that one of the best things in the world was the morale building of the troops, was to just go see them. And so we went every place. Usually, we on these visits, we would be in a convoy of sorts, and inasmuch as I was conducting the press, why, we'd be about 2 or 3 cars back. And just about the time we would come alongside of whoever it was, that would be the delayed reaction. They'd realize who it was that was coming to see them. If it was General Ike or Churchill or somebody like that, and it was just for us, being 3 cars back, 2 or 3 cars back in the convoy, it was just a constant succession of these wide-eyed, amazed faces of realizing who it was that they had just seen.
Now, the day actually approached. The tenseness in the Eisenhower headquarters increased.
He was a bit irritable for a week or 10 days beforehand. He had asked the cook to bake some beans. And he wanted the beans baked in a certain way. And none of us quite knew just how he wanted them baked. So we had 4 or 5 kinds of beans over a period of weeks, over a period of days. And he was never quite satisfied with any of the beans, and he vowed that he could make better beans than the cook was making.
One of Ike's key decisions came just before D-Day, regarding the paratroop drops to precede the invasion. General Bradley said they were imperative, but Air Marshal Lee Mowry, who was in charge of the air operations, felt the losses would be too high. General Bradley.
I wanted Airborne Division to drop back of Utah Beach, because right back of the beach there was a big swamp which the Germans had flooded, and just 2 or 3 narrow causeways going across. Well, a machine gun on each one of those It just causes you a lot of trouble because you can't flank them out. You can't get out and wade through the swamp. It's too deep. So I wanted the back of those swamps and the other end of those causeways secured by airborne. So the plan was to put the 82nd and 101st Airborne back of Utah Beach. And General Air Marshal Lee Mallory, the British man in charge of the air, objected. He said the losses to the airborne troops would be too great. And he didn't want to approve it, but Ike finally approved it. And we went ahead, and it's a good thing because they did drop back of that swamp and secure the outlets, and we went very fast off of Utah Beach.
Harry Butcher also recalls that Eisenhower decision.
The morning of D-Day, I happened to take the call in the tent camp at our command post of Air Marshal Lee Mallory, who was calling to convey to General Ike his congratulations on the decision to have the airborne operation go forward, that it had worked, and that he was relieved, and that the losses were substantially less than he had predicted. He was a very good sport about it, typically British, apologized for being putting a burden and extra responsibility on the Supreme Commander.
Ike was faced with another problem, another decision, this one involving Winston Churchill himself.
Churchill wanted to go on a destroyer on D-Day to see the action, to be a part of the invasion. And Ike had to tell Churchill that you were worth to me alive and safe and sound, away from the battle. In your regular job as Prime Minister, you're worth to me 2 divisions at least. If you go on this, if I let you go on the invasion fleet, it'll take X number of ships to look after you, and you'll be a nuisance. And Churchill wasn't satisfied with this decision. He wanted to go. And he said, I shall have to go to His Majesty and offer to lay down the mantle of my high office unless you let me go on this venture. And Ike said, no, I've told you, I don't want you to go. And he didn't go.
But the big decision came for Dwight Eisenhower as the window of go days arrived that first week of June, and the weather turned sour. Eisenhower recalled those days in a CBS interview filmed at Southwick House, Ike's advanced headquarters at Portsmouth.
Early on the morning of June 4th, I came from my camp about a mile from here, came into this room. And Captain Stagg, who was the chief meteorologist for the Allied forces, he was supported by 2 or 3 Americans, a couple other Britishers. But he made the presentations. That morning, the stars were out, it looked beautiful, and he gave us the worst report you ever saw. And he talked about gales hitting the Normandy beaches, and winds up to, the rate of 45 miles an hour, that kind of thing. Landing would be impossible. So I just said, all right, we have to postpone. So we postponed for 24 hours.
The morning of the 5th, that scene was repeated in the midst of a storm that shook Southwick House and proved the prediction of meteorologist Captain Stagg.
He said, well, now I'll give you some good news. And then he told us about this high that got in here and gave us some hope. And he, as I remember, he predicted this good weather would last between 24 and 36 hours. Now, that wasn't too good because you could get so many troops ashore and then have to stop landing. It would be pretty bad. But we were trying for these, these artificial ports, and we hoped that with this break, we could do it. It was still a chancy thing. But when he gave it and said that the waves now on the beaches were not going to be more than 3 feet or something of that kind, and the wind was going down, there'd be some opportunity for bombing, and the gunfire from the naval ships could be spotted pretty well. I thought it was just the best of a bad bargain, so I possibly sat silently just reviewing these things, maybe, I'd say 35 or 45 seconds. Now it's been reported by some of the people present. For example, my own chief staff says that's 5 minutes. Well, I know that wasn't, but 5 minutes under such conditions sounds like a year. Actually, I'd think after 30, 45 seconds, something like that, I just got up and said, okay, we'll go, and this room was emptied in 2 seconds.
And I think that is one of the most far-reaching decisions made during the whole war. Because 2 weeks later, there was a storm. We couldn't have gone then. It was much worse than the one we went in. And so we couldn't have gone 2 weeks later. And we had to get a port for supplies before the 15th of September, because in the channel, the storms get so bad after the 15th of September that you can't land supplies over the beach. So if we hadn't gone when we did, I don't know when we could have gone.
The decision made, and now the waiting. General Eisenhower recalled those long hours.
Well, of course, that's the most terrible time for the senior commander. He's done all that he can do, all the planning, and matter of fact, there's very little more that any commander above division command can do anything after once you get started. So, the first thing I did, I went over and fortified myself with a lot of coffee and breakfast. Then I began to go up and down the wharves. Some of the ships were still starting out, and I saw people that had sent them off and so on. And I came up here during the middle of the day to see if any news coming out, and I kept pretty close to my communication center. And then finally, along about 6 in the evening, I went over to a field from which the American airborne, started out. Now, I couldn't go to all these fields because there were many of them. But I did go into the 101st Division, and it was a very fine experience. They were getting ready and all camouflaged and their faces blackened and all this. And there they saw me, and of course they'd recognize me. And they said, "Now quit worrying, gentlemen, we'll take care of this thing for you." And that kind of things was a good feeling. As they started off, I watched them out of sight. Then it took me a couple hours to get back to my headquarters.
Thor Smith.
We didn't get back until the early hours of the morning, and then we knew that H hour was just a few hours away, so we stayed up, and it was very tense because it was the show was on, but there was no feedback at that point, and so you just nothing to do except sit and wait for, and actually a little frustrating too. I mean, even for General Ike, it wasn't anything for him to do except sit and wait.
And as he waited, 1,000 ships were churning through the English Channel, and within a few hours, the 6th of June, 1944, would take its place in the memory of mankind.
The Eisenhower Years, produced by Extension Radio Television at Kansas State University on a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. The producer-narrator is Ralph Titus. Research by Anne Frank. Music for the Eisenhower Years was composed by Gail Kubik, performed by the Kansas State University Chamber Symphony, conducted by Luther Levengood. Our thanks to CBS News for providing General Eisenhower's interview at Southwick House. Next week, D-Day, the conclusion. This is Paul DeWeese.